All right, welcome everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome our speakers and panelists today who have come from all over the world and from across Australia to tell us about their research on speciation in what is the first joint panel discussion hosted by the School of Biosciences at the University of Melbourne, or Melbourne University, sorry, and the Research School of Biology here at the ANU where I am. So it's very tempting to talk about, all the wonderful things that our speakers have done, but unfortunately, we're not going to have a lot of time for that today. So I'm not going to go into the many achievements and important contributions that our speakers have made over the years, but I do think that the work that they present today will speak for itself. And I want to save as much time as possible for questions and discussions at the end. I will, however, just quickly run through the format so that our audience knows what to expect. So first up, we'll have Daniel, who is a Dean of the Faculty of Science at the, I don't know how to pronounce your university, sorry. I'm going to give it a go though. Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. And he'll be speaking about his work on the role of migration in speciation. Daniel will be followed by Jenny, who is from the Michigan State University in the USA, and she will present a new hypothesis that addresses a disconnect between empirical and theoretical speciation research. So I'm super excited about both of these talks. Each speaker will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. I'll play an animal sound at 15 minutes to help our speakers keep on time and make sure that there's enough time for discussion. And then after both talks is when our panelists will kick off the discussion and we'll invite questions from the audience. So if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat, you can write it in the Q&A, or even better, raise your hand and we'll unmute you so that you can ask your question. Okay, I think that's it for now. So I'm super excited, and without further ado, I would like to welcome Daniel Cadena to the stage. If you could share your slides.
Yes. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Good. Well, great. Thanks, Megan, for the introduction and the invitation. And thanks, Craig, Debbie, Ileana, everybody for making this happen. It's exciting to be from the other side of the world speaking to you guys. So it's Wednesday evening here in Bogota. I was told it's a beautiful day on Thursday in Australia, so it's exciting to to be here. I'm going to present some work we've been doing on speciation in the neotropics, which is largely empirical, which I think is going to complement the more theoretical work that we'll see by Jenny later on. And Ileana asked me to talk about migration and speciation, but I'm going to touch on other things that I think might be interesting for this audience. And I'm going to emphasize that I'm going to speculate quite a bit. This is like an informal discussion, I understand, and this is not a job talk or anything like that. So hopefully it will make for a fun discussion later on. So I'm of course I live here in Bogota, Colombia. I'm very interested in diversity in the tropics. Colombia is the country with the highest diversity of birds worldwide. We have nearly 2,000 species, and I'm very interested in understanding the causes of mega diversity. And of course, a lot of the causes of the huge diversity of the neotropics exemplified here by patterns of diversity of vertebrates overall on the map on the left, and species with restricted ranges on the right are explanations based on evolutionary processes like speciation and extinction. I'll focus on the speciation side of the equation today. And so one of the reasons why things speciate a lot, I think, in the tropics, and that contributes to high species richness in these systems, is that we have a very complex topography which leads to populations becoming geographically isolated and then divergence in isolation. So here's an example of some of the work we've done on, say, a widespread species in the Andes, where you can see on the map on the right. I'm actually gonna make sure I can use my pointer. Please bear with me for a little sec here. Okay, that works now. So the points are localities where we sampled specimens. In this case, we sequenced a mitochondrial DNA, built a phylogenetic tree. What I want you to see here is that within a single species, there are all these very different genetic lineages, which are separated from each other by barriers. So there's a lot of geographic complexity that leads to isolation of populations, divergence in allopatry. And I think that's a very important component of speciation in the tropics. That complex topography leads to complicated patterns of variation, not only in genetics, but also in phenotypes. And this is an example of a system we've been working on for many years, where you can see these birds which vary in the presence or absence of a pectoral band, the extent of that pectoral band. And you can see here in this map to the right that these patterns vary in these sort of chaotic checkerboard fashion. So things get isolated, they diverge in signals, which may be related to communication that leads to the buildup of diversity in the long run. And I'm particularly interested in diversity in mountains. And when you look at mountains from a global perspective, you can see, based on this review paper by Jan Fjelse and his colleagues, that tropical mountains in particular are hotspots for both species that originated a long time ago, so ancient species, and both recent species. So to use a jargon that has been repeatedly used, the tropical mountains are both cradles where there's a lot of speciation, and also museums where there's a lot of persistence of old lineages. And I'm particularly interested in this pattern where you look at mountains globally, and mountains are hotspots of beta diversity. So there's a lot of turnover in space. So this is replacement of bird species spatially, and you can see that there's a lot of turnover in tropical mountains. And that relates to a general pattern in tropical organisms, which is very common in birds, which is this pattern where closely related species replace each other across elevational gradients. And I've been very interested in understanding the origins of those elevational replacements. And I could speak for a full hour about this, but what I'm going to say is that I think we've done enough work to come up with some generalities in terms of how these elevational replacements arise. So here's an example of a group of birds we've been working on for several years now, and I'm showing you on the right 4 different elevational gradients. And you can see the elevational distributions of species in these ranges. And you can see this pattern where species have restricted ranges and replace each other as you move across elevations. And one idea that has been prominent in the literature is that those elevational replacements might reflect what people have called a parapatric speciation. So an ancestor reaches a given mountain system, say the isolated Sierra Nevada, Santa Marta in Colombia, and you get divergence owing to selection, with one species becoming adapted to lowlands and the other to highlands, and that's how you end up with these replacements. This hypothesis of parapatric ecological speciation would predict that things replacing each other with elevation are close relatives, but actually we don't see good evidence of that. You can see here that for all these mountains, say take these 2 endemics to the Santa Marta Mountains of Colombia, they replace each other with elevation, but here in the phylogeny, you can see that they're not close relatives. Same here for 6 species replacing each other on the western slope of the Colombian Andes, and so forth. So what we think here is that actually, I think we can safely say that the most common mode of divergence in mountains is allopatric divergence. And then geographic ranges change and things end up stacked in these mountains following secondary contact. So we can reject, I think, in general, this idea of parapatric divergence. Well, so far I've emphasized what you would, I would say textbook examples of speciation, where people categorize speciation based on whether there are geographic barriers or there are no barriers, and you focus on the role of allopatry versus selection and parapatry. But today I want to focus on other modes of evolutionary divergence, which I think have been a lot less explored. I don't want to argue that these are more prevalent, but given the perspective of this seminar, I think they would make for interesting discussion. And the first one I want to talk about is the role of changes in migratory behavior in microevolution and whether that might extend to macroevolution. So this is based largely on work that my former grad student, Valentina Gomez did, which was published last year, focus on this species here, the fork-tailed flycatcher from South America. So this species is what people call a partial migrant. So if you look at this map, this looks through time at the seasonal distribution of birds in different parts of the continent. And I want you to focus in this region here, the Llanos of Colombia, which you will see that throughout the year, there are populations of birds living here. But at a given time in the year, some of these birds move and then spend some time here in Argentina and southern Brazil, and then they come back. So this is what people call a partial migrant. So it's a species or species complex that has resident populations that stay here in Colombia throughout the year, and migratory populations, which migrate to southern South America where they breed and then come back in the austral winter. So what we wanted to know was whether these populations with different migratory behavior might be on the path to becoming different species. And I'm going to summarize a lot of work in a single slide. So we did a bunch of different things in this study. One of the things we did was look at the genetic relationships of populations using genomic data. And here's a phylogenetic tree summarizing what we found. Turns out that all these deep branches correspond to migratory subspecies, which breed in Argentina and come seasonally to Colombia. And then the sedentary subspecies, which stay much through all the year in the northern South America, are derived. They're nested actually within the migratory subspecies. We also looked at a bunch of different additional things, like in terms of genetic variation. The sedentary population has very low genetic diversity, has all the genetic signals of a bottlenecked population, whereas the presumably ancestor migratory subspecies has a lot more genetic diversity and genetic evidence of perhaps stable populations. We also studied the time when these birds breed. The birds that belong to the sedentary subspecies breed between February and April, whereas the migratory subspecies breed between October and January. And actually, these birds are St. Patrick during part of the year, where when the resident subspecies are breeding, the migrants are here, but they're not engaging in reproduction. And actually, Valentina found that these birds also differ morphologically. So the sedentary subspecies have wings that are perhaps not well adapted for long distance flight and have very long tails, presumably as a result of greater sexual selection. Whereas the migratory ones have these narrow pointed wings that are likely adaptive for migrating long distances, and shorter tails, which presumably are also adaptive for migration. So based on all this, we propose that these lineages are actually different species that are isolated based on a variety of different mechanisms, and we actually found no gene flow between them, which to me indicates that these things are different species. And Valentina went a step further, and she looked at whether changes in migratory behavior, like in this case, in which a loss of migration might have led to the origin of a new species, might occur more generally in the family, which are the flycatchers. And she actually mapped these traits of being migratory, sedentary, or partially migratory in the whole flycatcher phylogeny. And she actually found support for a model where partial migration, having populations that are both resident and or migratory, seems to be an intermediate step, which is consistent with some models for the evolution of migration. But what she found that was pretty interesting is that the more common evolutionary pathway is for migratory lineages to become sedentary, so loss of migration as opposed to gains of migration. And this typically occurs through this partially migratory state, which is exactly what we found happened in these birds here. And Valentina went a step further and estimated rates of speciation from molecular phylogenies of the flycatchers. And she found that speciation rates are much higher in partially migratory and migratory lineages compared to sedentary lineages. So we think that perhaps changes in behavior, in migratory behavior, are an important driver of speciation in this system. And something I want to point out is that changes in migratory behavior, we don't think, at least initially, are triggered by genetic changes. It's not like a bird inherits a mutation that tells it not to migrate. So it might be initiated by plasticity, whereby some individuals stay as opposed to migrate, and that initial plasticity might, develop later on into evolved genetic differences as populations adapt to new regimes. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is the role of seasonal reproduction in the divergence of populations and perhaps the origin of new species. So in the case of the flycatchers, we had both allopatry and allochrony. So things breed in different sites and breed at different times. But now I'm going to focus on the idea of allochronic reproduction, so reproduction at different times of year. And this slide here shows work that has been done on this species of antbird from Panama. And what I want you to see here is that the gonads of birds throughout the year, these are males here and females here, fluctuate in size. So birds are not reproductively active throughout the year, even in tropical environments. And much of what we know about the timing of breeding in birds indicates that breeding is related to food abundance. And food abundance, in turn, is related to rainfall. So birds seem to time their seasonal reproduction to match pulses in food availability, which are related to rainfall. Now I want you to look at this map, and perhaps if you want to stay with me, pay attention to this part here in the, say, central Amazon. What you can see here is that areas of the map that are shown in these purple, magenta here are areas where it's raining a lot in a given moment in time, whereas areas in red are areas where it's raining very little. And I'm going to circle through a full year, starting in January. So you can see here in January, it's raining a lot in this part of the Amazon. And it's dry, say here up north in the Llanos. This is February, March, April, June, May, June, July. And see, the pattern is now flipped. Now it's raining a lot here, and it's dry here. And I can circle throughout the end of the year to come back to where we started. And actually, we think that this seasonal variation in climates leads to seasonal reproduction in birds. And this is work that my PhD student, Miguel Moreno, is completing now. What he has here on the figure on the left, he collected all the data he could get his hands on for breeding condition of birds throughout the country. And what you can see here is that, well, most birds in Colombia, on average, tend to breed between April and May, which is the beginning of the rainy season in many areas. But I'm showing you here two different sites, which are not very far from each other. And you can see here that most birds are breeding in March, mid-March, whereas in this other site nearby, they're breeding later on in May. So what if this asynchronous breeding might promote evolutionary divergence? And actually, this is an idea that has floated in the literature for a while, but my actually undergrad student, Ignacio Quintero, worked on this for his thesis. And he sort of proposed this idea, or developed this idea, that if, say, you have different localities, say locality A and locality B, and what you can see here is precipitation throughout the year, these two areas are very asynchronous in their peaks in the rainy season, right? So if birds are timing their reproduction to match pulses in resources that are mined by the rainy seasons, then you would expect relatively little gene flow between these two localities compared to localities where the seasonal regimes in precipitation are very similar. So what Ignacio did was actually test the prediction that populations that occur in more asynchronous environments in terms of precipitation regimes are more genetically differentiated than populations that are more synchronous. And he did this based on a large sample of neotropical birds. And I'm summarizing here a lot of work that he did. And so basically these are Mantell coefficients relating asynchrony in precipitation to genetic divergence across a bunch of different species of birds. And to my surprise, he found that there's a cross-species significant effect in a meta-analysis, whereby populations that are more asynchronous in precipitation are more genetically differentiated. So we think, well, maybe there is some evidence that this might lead to genetic divergence. We've actually expanded this to another system. So we looked at this in nearly 60 species of neotropical frogs. And here again, what I'm showing you here are the beta coefficients of the relationship between asynchrony in rainfall and the degree of genetic divergence among populations. And we get a small but significant and positive effect of asynchrony in rainfall on genetic divergence across multiple species of frogs. So I don't want to argue that this is very important, but we're seeing a signal here that this might be relevant and worth considering. The question, of course, is how much does this matter in terms of the patterns of diversity that I showed at the beginning? And I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to explain much of this, but I'm just going to say, well, we try to correlate spatially the asynchrony in precipitation among sites within quadrats in the neotropics to things like speciation rates, estimated based on molecular phylogenies, and species richness. And we actually did not find any relationship. So while we're seeing an effect perhaps at the population genetic level, we don't think this is persistent enough to lead to the origin of new species. But I think it's interesting because it makes us at least think about this possibility. So to finalize, what I wanted to say is that a lot of the work that has been done on diversification in the tropics has emphasized things such as changes in the landscape, like the uplift of the Andes, fragmenting populations, the formation of the Amazon River system, the fluctuations in climate of the Pleistocene driving divergence. And the point I want to make for the discussion today is that even if we do not invoke any of these changes on the static landscape that we have right now in South America, there are two things. One is behavior, in which plasticity in behavior related to changes in whether populations migrate or not might spur the origin of new species. And the other is that the spatial template of how climate varies might also promote speciation in the absence of any changes in the landscape. And here, also for discussion, I think it's interesting that in the case of switches in migratory behavior, I emphasize perhaps a role for plasticity, organisms being plastic and deciding or migrating or not. But then in the case of allochronic breeding, it's actually lack of plasticity which might drive divergence, because if organisms disperse and are able to easily adjust to the local conditions, you would not see divergence via this mechanism. And with that, I'll end and just say that, well, these patterns of diversity in mountains, which have fascinated people for many years in the tropics, including one of my favorites, Francisco José de Caldas, a Colombian naturalist, I think can be illuminated by thinking about them from an evolutionary perspective. And with that, I'll thank a lot of people I've collaborated with over the years, students we've done work with, and a bunch of funding sources. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was really big. I wish we could ask questions now, but we'll have to wait. Jenny, if you could.
Okay.
Daniel unshare, and then Jenny, if you could share.
Let me just make my, I'm making my
Doing fancy things with your pointer.
visible. Yeah.
Yep, we can see it, or I can see it.
You can see it? Great, okay. Let me just close that. And that, okay, oops.
Take it away, thank you.
Okay, so like Daniel, I want to thank the organizers for organizing this. It sounds really exciting to get this panel going. And I'm looking forward to questions. I have a bunch from Daniel's talk, which was fantastic. And I guess maybe I wanted to just start by saying, Daniel pointed out that there may be lots of things going on that cause speciation to happen. And I agree wholeheartedly with that view. I'm going to focus today on one thing that might help, and that's called sexual selection. So taking it away. So we find that species often differ a lot in female preference and male display. Sometimes these differences are even bigger than the ecological traits that characterize species. And these differences in sexually selected traits are one of the main reasons people think sexual selection might help speciation. And the basic idea is, oh no, I'm not looking here. Let me make myself a laser again. Okay, well, it's not working. Anyway, so this is a preference function, and it shows different preferences for two species. In this case, I have one species where females prefer and males display lots of eye spots, and another species where females prefer and males display very few eye spots. And the idea is that male display in this species is for few eye spots, and it doesn't even really overlap the preference function for the high spot preferring females. And so that means basically they're not going to mate with one another, and that helps speciation to proceed. So that's part of the main idea, but there are a lot of models out there that suggest that instead of helping, preferences often interfere with the speciation process. And this will be especially true when preferences are less differentiated than other traits like display traits. And that's shown here. You have a male display trait distribution for one species here, shown in blue, and the other species there. And these are quite different from one another. If the female preferences are less differentiated, shown here in the red dotted lines, what's going to happen is the female preferences are going to pull the distribution closer together, resulting in more similar trait distributions after sexual selection acts than if sexual selection wasn't present. So these models suggest that instead of helping speciation, sexual selection often hurts. So there's a whole nother set of models out there that posit that instead of two distinct preferences acting or having two different display traits, you can have speciation occur with a single preference for a single male display trait if that trait's condition dependent. And the idea underlying these models is that if the trait is condition dependent, then males in one environment who are locally adapted will have good condition, and therefore they can express the high values of the display trait. Whereas a foreign male coming in is not adapted, has poor condition, and has a lousy display. So females who prefer that one condition dependent trait will reject the foreign males because they don't have a trait that's attractive. Only the local males have that attractive trait. So these models say that sexual selection can, in fact, foster speciation, and they've been very influential, but they can't tell us how display or preference come to differ between species. So to address these issues, I worked with a collaborator who's a theoretician, Maria Cervedio, and we developed a model that's really born out of empirical observations and my own observations of watching males and females interact with one another in nature over mating. So it's a nice example, I think, of Imperi meeting theory. And so me in the short hair and Maria in the long hair shown right there. We both had fellowships from the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies in Uppsala, Sweden. And this turned out to be a really awesome place to think hard and work on this project together. And we had two main goals for the project. The first was to explain diversity of display and preference and how they can evolve. And the second was to ask whether sexual selection actually helps speciation or instead hurts it. And so there are a couple different ways that female preferences can differ. I mean, there's lots of different ways, but I want you to focus on two. Females can prefer different values of the same trait, so long tails versus short tails, but they can also prefer different traits altogether, such as colorful males versus large ones. And I want to focus today, and our model focuses on this second situation where there's distinctly different or categorically different traits that males express, and ask how this evolves. And so the idea comes out of sort of an analogy that I have that I actually developed when Megan was in my lab. And so I call this the ecological stage. And again, it's born out of observations by myself and many, many, many scientists from around the world that show that habitats where mating occurs differ in all kinds of ways. They differ in visibility, they differ in the presence of vegetation, temperature, predation risk, population density. I could go on and on. So now imagine that you are a male who's trying to attract a female, and you find yourself in a brightly lit and low vegetation environment, and you have a large body size, and females in your species are really like big males. So there you are, you're doing good. In this particular environment, body size is not only easy to see, but it's also easy to compare large and small males. So females can make a choice. Now you're in a different environment or stage, and this one is poorly lit and has lots of vegetation, and size is actually really hard to both see and evaluate. And so instead, bright colors are effective at having you sort of stand out from the background. And not only that, females can tell the difference between a bright and a dull male. And so in this different environment or stage, then you find a different trait is actually effective at attracting the female. So this idea is basically, if you think about the specific conditions or environments that males and females are interacting over mating as a stage, then that's the seed of the idea. And I'll just say that this is supported that there could be lots of differences in these ecological stages, because so many people have done studies that show us that differences in habitat, differences in ecological interactions actually alter the way that sexual selection operates. And some of those studies also suggest that it can actually target or favor different kinds of displays. So the idea, I think, requires a little bit more detail to explain. So this is a figure that shows you sort of the conceptual underpinnings of the model. So we're going to compare two different environments or ecological stages. Environment one is characterized by a primary selective agent of parasites. So in this particular environment, parasites are prevalent. Parasite resistance is highly selected on. And males who are in good condition, because they are resistant to parasites, can also express bright red coloration. In this species, females like red color. And the reason that this preference evolves is because females obtain benefits of choice when they pick high condition males who also have this bright red color. So basically, coloration is honestly indicating the extent of local adaptation of a particular individual. So you compare that to a different environment where there's a different primary selective agent. In this case, it's food availability. So this you can think of as a different ecological stage. So here, food availability is scarce. Males who have good foraging ability can get a lot of food that puts them in high condition, and they can grow to large body size. In this species, females like large males, and like the other case, they gain benefits of choosing large males who are in high condition, and that is indicated now by large body size instead of bright red color. So this happens again in allopatry. And basically what's going on is that you've got in ecological stage number one, under parasite selection, males who are in the right habitat have locally adapted alleles. They can be in good body condition and express bright red color. Contrast that with over here in the other environment or ecological stage. Again, males are in the right environment, they have the locally adapted alleles, they can be in good condition and therefore express the large body size. So this all happens in allopatry. What happens on secondary contact? So the idea of the model is that the females here are females from environment one, and they will not prefer to mate with males from environment two because those males don't express red coloration. Instead, they're big. And similarly over here, females from the second environment will refuse to mate with the males from the first because they don't express large body size. Instead, they have bright red coloration. So if that happens, and when that happens, reproductive isolation should be maintained. And you can think of this as basically we've got categorically different condition-dependent traits that indicate local adaptation. And if I were to summarize the idea behind this model, it's really that the ecological stage favors preference evolution for honest indicators of local adaptation. So for the talk today, because I have to condense it, I want to really focus on this question of what happens on secondary contact and really ask three different questions. Is differentiation maintained in the ecological traits in the male displays? Do preferences stay diverged? And probably most importantly, are the species reproductively isolated when they come back together? And so I, again, don't have a whole lot of time, so I can't tell you all the structure of the model, but I can give you some of the basic features. So we do have these categorically different traits, and therefore the model has separate loci for the two ecological traits, the two male display traits, and the two female preferences. And this not only adds realism that I think is really important, but it's also quite distinct from prior models. The male displays are costly for the males to express, and we have those costs experienced in accordance with condition-dependent theory. And moreover, males who try to express two traits experience trade-offs from doing so. Females experience search costs, and we include this for lots of reasons. One is that typically this foils the evolution of preference and display in theoretical models, but also because it's very likely that females do experience search costs in nature. And the model also includes both direct and indirect benefits of choice. We do this also for a couple of reasons. One is that it broadens the context in which the model might be applicable. And it also allows us to ask whether either or both of these are necessary for evolution to proceed. And in marked departure from previous models on speciation, we don't apply any direct disruptive selection on either the display or the preference. And we do this even though it's typically expected that these are really essential for speciation to proceed, but it allows us to focus on the role of sexual selection. So with that bit of background, what do we find? So again, what happens on secondary contact? So the first and maybe one of our most important findings is that we do maintain really high preference differentiation on secondary contact. So this figure, it's like the ones to follow. In all cases on the x-axis, we show the strength of female preferences, and differentiation is shown on the y. And you can see that lots of preference differentiation is maintained. And this occurs whenever preferences are reasonably strong, and really when they're 2 to 4 times stronger than, or when they're, females are 2 to 4 times more likely to mate with a preferred male than randomly, you get the maintenance of pretty high differentiation. We think that this occurs in part because essentially strong preferences increase linkage between the female preference and both the ecological and the display traits. And by doing so, they increase the indirect selection that the preferences experience. Not only that, but females gain benefits of choice for the particular benefits that are really favored in their local environment. And so we find that females can actually prefer distinctly different male display traits. And this is different from some of those prior models that I mentioned earlier. We also find that we can maintain differentiation both in the male display and the ecological traits. The figure is quite similar to the previous one, here showing trait differentiation either for male display traits, which are showed in the dotted lines, or ecological traits in the dashed lines. And you can see here that male displays actually remain more differentiated. And we think this occurs because the male displays experience both ecological selection and also sexual selection. I show you here some of the effects of both natural selection and also preference strength. And basically the 3 line colors are different values of ecological selection. And you can see that they make a difference in many cases, but they don't actually change the pattern that's created by sexual selection. And so again, we find that distinctly different male displays can be maintained in different populations, even when there's the possibility for gene flow. And the most important finding is on this slide, which is what happens with hybridization. And we find that in fact, hybridization remains quite low across most preference strengths, suggesting that reproductive isolation between these populations is actually maintained, and that would facilitate the speciation process. So the ecological stage mechanism, I think, is shown to be able to explain not only differentiation of female preference and male display, but also one of the ways that sexual selection might facilitate the process of speciation. And so one of the things that really surprised us in this model is that search costs are essential. They're not just allowed, they actually are required to make it go forward under many of our parameter combinations. And this surprised us because search costs aren't supposed to do that. They're supposed to have the opposite effect. Not only that, I will say that when we started this, Maria predicted that both preferences would sweep both populations, and then we'd have full homogenization and two things would be preferred across the board. But in fact, this doesn't happen. And it seems that that's caused because the search costs actually depend on the display frequency in the population that you're focused on. And the figure below shows how this might occur. So the x-axis here is search costs as we apply in the model. And this is the effective search cost as measured, experienced by females in the populations. And so the solid lines here show that as we increase search costs in the model, in fact, those search costs don't really increase very much. And this is really because the preferred display is actually very common in the local population. But then if you look at the foreign population, you find that the search costs are quite high. And we think that's because the display that's preferred is actually very rare in that population. So search costs actually help to select against foreign preference. And so I'm trying to keep it short. I just want to make a plug here. So my lab group actually has recently published an experimental test of this idea. And in that experiment, we used a split clutch experimental design. We measured a whole lot of fitness components. And what we were doing is to test the prediction from the ecological stage model that the benefits that females experience from choosing preferred and non-preferred males in two different environments are actually also different. So the females obtain different benefits based on the environment that they find themselves in. And shorthand answer is yes, this happens. The benefits are quite different. It depends on ecology. And that paper was published as part of a special issue last year called The Late Stages of Speciation. It's got a longer title, but that'll get you there if you're interested, and it's in Philosophical Transactions. And so I hope I've convinced you that biodiversity can be maintained by interactions between sexual selection and ecology. And I think this actually connects to Daniel's points about how ecology, different aspects of ecology, are fostering speciation over maybe more macro scales. My focus is on the process, so I have to study things as they're happening, not so much after the fact, and you can look at the phylogeny, but it seems like differences in ecology, and I maintain also differences in sexual selection, can help the process of speciation both early and then later on as it proceeds to full isolation. And I'll just conclude by thanking some generous funders, including the Swedish Collegium, a bunch of NSF grants to me. I had a Fulbright fellowship, and we have an NSF center here called Beacon, and that also funded some of this work. I've had awesome, smart, hardworking people in my lab over the years, and they definitely supported the idea and the data collection. And I'd like to thank all of you for listening. And whenever questions are allowed, I'm happy to take them. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Jenny. All right, I've stuck around because I remembered that I forgot to introduce our panelists at the beginning. So
Well, then you better
do that just quickly now. So we have Craig Moritz from the ANU. You can see him there. We have Megan Higgy from JCU, James Cook University in Northern Queensland, and also Devi Stewart-Fox from Melbourne University. So I'm going to disappear now and let you take it away with questions and discussions. Thank you.
Who's going to go first?
Yeah, I just want to say amazing talks from both of you. Thank you so much. One of the amazing unexpected benefits of being stuck in our various places is that we're getting to hear these amazing talks from people. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing both of those amazing talks with us. It's incredible.
That's really nice of you to say.
Now, I have a slow thinking brain, so I have a couple of questions, but they're not fully formed yet. So I'm just going to sit back and let those kind of brew a bit. If anyone else has anything, that'd be great.
It was absolutely stimulating. I have to say, that just made me, so many thoughts going through my head as I listened to both of those talks. And I think there are really strong connections between them. And so I guess, one idea that's you come across frequently in the speciation literature is this idea that ecological differentiation is essential to start the speciation process, and then sexual selection kicks in later on in the process to complete it. And I was wondering, what you, I guess, would your model challenge that in any way, Jenny? Or do you think that that's a generally true characterization of the process?
Okay, so I'll say that I don't think the model challenges that. The whole premise is that there are differences in ecology, and that we started with allopatric divergence. I will say that we also did the model under a scenario where there wasn't divergence already. So we're thinking of sympatric speciation, and it works sometimes, but there are constraints on various aspects of when that works. So it can work from in a sympatric sense, but again, depending on ecological differentiation. And I have, over the many years I've been studying sexual selection and speciation, come to the fairly strongly held opinion that both of these things are necessary for speciation to really go forward and complete. I know there are people who disagree with me and think that one or the other can happen. And some people think it's all sexual selection. Some people think it's all ecological selection. I think the natural world shows us that things are changing. These are interacting in so many different ways, and changes in behavior and the way mating occurs alter ecology and adaptation, and changes in ecology turn around and alter the way that mating occurs. So I think it's all intertwined personally.
And then I guess there's the question of how different does the ecological stage have to be to favour, categorically different traits. And that just, I guess that's, Daniel, your talk was very much about that. How different does that ecological stage have to be? So differences in migratory behaviour, absolutely sufficient. Perhaps differences in rainfall, not quite sufficient in many cases, I guess. So I guess the question would be, how different do you think those, the ecological stage has to be to favour categorically different display traits? Would that be a common situation?
Are you asking both of us?
Either. You can both speak to that. So.
Danny, you can go first since I already talked.
Okay, thanks. Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I think to me, it's striking that, so I've been, we've been working a lot on these mountains that have very steep ecological gradients, and you would say, well, adaptation to the lowlands entails very different traits than adaptation to the highlands, and you would think that this is a very steep selective gradient, but we don't see good examples of parapatric divergence with elevation, despite these things being very different. So I don't know if it's because populations are connected by gene flow, and then selection has to be super strong to counteract the effects of gene flow. So yeah, I don't know how strong these gradients need to be. And then the other side of the coin is that we see a lot of speciation with no, at least in the systems we work, with no obvious ecological divergence. So things speciating within the same, say, elevational belt, but in allopatry. And then, the environment is essentially the same. So some people would say, well, maybe things diverge just via drift. but it could also be selection via this mechanism of mutation order speciation, where you might have like different solutions to living in the same environment, and it's the mutation process that determines where populations go in the, say, adaptive landscape and things like that. But yeah, I have no intuition, but for how different environments need to be for selection to lead to speciation. But I'm just curious that it seems to be rare, at least when things are in geographic contact. Of course, if you have divergence in allopatry with ecological divergence, as Jenny's model had, well, probably things can diverge more easily, no? I would guess.
So I wonder if I could ask a question now, unless you're ready to go, Megan. So thanks again, both of you, for really wonderful, provocative presentations. Daniel, I'll start with you, but it connects with some of the work you've published on as well, Jenny, which is the importance of ecological divergence for completing speciation, or really as a major component of divergent selection in speciation. Yet ecological conditions are in great flux, whether it's natural climatic oscillations, ecological succession, or anthropogenic climate change. So I hadn't really appreciated before, Daniel, till you showed us the evidence, just how prevalent this issue of timing of migration and its connection to speciation could be. Yet it seems like it's underpinned by plasticity and very rapid ecological change and flux. So it seems like for ecology to really drive speciation to completion, you've got to have a very stable ecological difference driving that divergence for long enough to accumulate all the genetic incompatibilities or whatever. So it's a rambling question. I'm really interested in failed speciation. So if we've got these ecologically dependent mechanisms, how often will they stick around long enough to really achieve speciation? That's kind of the question.
Yeah, well, those are very good points, Craig. And I think, well, in terms of this mechanism of temporal isolation driven by climate, we tend to see an effect at the population genetic level, but I don't think we have good evidence that it scales up to the origin of new species and to the accumulation of diversity. So probably these things are sort of, they initiate divergence, but you need, persistence of the ecological conditions for a sufficiently long period of time for, to this really be a plausible mechanism of speciation. And I think that there are other similar examples of things like that. Like, say, we have these ecotones in Africa between forests and savannas, where you see a lot of species showing adaptive divergence despite gene pool, very strong selection. But you don't find sister species occurring in the forest and the savanna. So yeah, adaptation sort of begins and you get divergence, but probably things change. I mean, the environment changes fast enough that it's not enough for that to lead to a speciation. So perhaps you need some sort of reinforcement via behavior when things come together to complete speciation. I don't know. Jenny?
No, that's a really good question, and one I've thought about a lot. I don't have the answer either, but some ideas that come to me are, I think it takes more than one mechanism to have speciation actually be finished. And I think that, scientists try to find out if their favorite thing will do it, and their favorite thing might help. I don't think sexual selection can act on its own very often to cause new species to form. There might be occasions when that occurs, but I think it's not commonly that way. So multiple barriers, multiple mechanisms may be standing in for when the ecologies are less different, et cetera. It can continue to build. And as you were talking, Craig, I was reminded of a figure from one of the Grants papers where they're showing the way selection's acting on beak shape across time. And it continues to go in a direction. I forget exactly what's on the axes. I just remember the pattern, but it goes like this. Yeah. Over time, you get there, but you're going up and down and up and down and up and down over that time. And so maybe it's something like that, that as ecologies are changing in one way, so there's less rainfall, but there's more, it's hotter or something. Those are acting in different ways on phenotypes and genes compared, so it seems like, again, multiple things, and we can't expect a continual increase in reproductive isolation leading to species. A lot of times I think the process fails, which is why we don't have 3 zillion species on this planet, but just several million, right? So I think that the speciation outcome is actually a fairly rare one in these divergence processes. And it really does take some constellation of things. If you're thinking that's where I'm going to, it takes a constellation of things to get you there. That's one perspective, at least.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. That's for giving me the time to formulate my question, everyone. So my question is actually specifically to Jenny about the formulation of your model. So you use 2 different categorical traits. Can you imagine a situation where you were working on the same trait, but because most traits are multivariate in nature and therefore multigenic in nature, that in ecological selection in different environments has prioritized different things? And I'm kind of thinking an easy way for me to think is in terms of pheromones. So you might have pheromones that are well adapted to a wet environment, pheromones that are well adapted to a dry environment. Can you think through how that could fit into your same model? And if it does fit?
I think it could fit. We developed the model with these categorically distinct traits, partly to really emphasize that you can get big differences and that those big differences can persist. But I think that it could work with basically this alternative perspective of females like more of one thing and less of the other, but it's the same trait axis. So one pheromone versus the other. Something I didn't mention in today is that we have these 2 loci for each set of traits. And it turns out that that's not only biologically realistic, but it really makes a difference. It helps the process a lot. So I think if the genetic variation is distributed across multiple loci, then that also facilitates the process. So, and the seed of that idea is that if you've got multiple loci, selection on one doesn't actually affect the alleles at the other one very much. And so you don't get this one displacing that one, you just get this one fixing one allele, and that one can fix it, whatever allele too. And so I think, again, as long as there's some genetic complexity, the model would still apply.
Yeah, because I actually I'm pretty sure, not that I'm a modeler, but I'm pretty sure I can imagine a situation where you don't need to have them as categorical variables. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I said.
So I think it's super broadly applicable.
So I'm sorry,
Awesome.
I'm going to interrupt just quickly here because I know that some people might have other time commitments. I'm enjoying the discussion, and I know that a lot of other people are as well. So if people can stick around for a little bit longer, that would be really great. But if people have to go, then please feel free to do so. I don't know, how are you guys positioned for time?
I'm happy to stay for as long as you want.
You're happy to stay for a bit longer? Megan, did you have a lecture to go to, or you're okay?
I got the time zone mixed up, so I'm earlier than what I thought it'd be, which is fantastic. So it's like in the best situation possible. Yeah.
Okay, well, if anyone needs to step out, please just feel free to do so, but we'll keep recording for a bit longer because this is really great. And I think there's maybe 1 or 2 questions in the audience too, so potentially if we could take those. I don't know how to do the unmuting thing, so Ileana is going to take control of that, I think. Is that right, Ili?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay.
Ileana, have you unmuted me?
Yep,
Yes, she has.
Oh, the power. Thanks. I have a question for Daniel. I've actually encouraged first-year students to come along and attend this, and I don't know how many will be there. So it's quite a basic question, I think. You had a figure where you showed the rate of transition between migration, partial migration, and sedentary, and you had many more transitions from partial migration to sedentary. So I sort of have 2 little questions here, and they're quite naive. One is, if that's the case, does that mean over time you expect migration to vanish? Is that the trajectory, the long-term evolutionary trajectory? Because whenever you see these asymmetries, it implies that the world's heading towards migration, well, in this case, migration disappearing. And the second little question is, when you were talking about it, because we're talking about speciation, you talked about the transitions as rates of speciation, but would it be more correct to say it's sort of the rates of biodiversity because you don't know what went extinct? And how would that affect your interpretation? That's my longish question. And thank you both for fantastic talks. I thought they were absolutely superb.
Oh, thanks, Michael, for your comments and the question. Yeah, well, we do see that loss of migration appears to be more common. But I don't know if that necessarily means that migration is sort of on the way out, because we also see a bunch of gains of migration through time. And we're here looking at the history of this clade over, say, I don't know, more than 20 million years. So over that very long period of time, the loss of migration has probably been more frequent than its gain. But also you could think about, like, you know, with changes in like large scale changes in climate, you might have periods of time where, you know, conditions favor the evolution of migration, whereas in other periods, conditions favor the loss of migration. So it probably fluctuates through time. And actually, it's interesting that we're seeing, like in this moment in time, we're seeing very good examples of loss of migration, like in real time. So birds stopping, and we have a couple species, at least here in Colombia, that are, you know, boreal migrants that are staying and are breeding here. So you can actually see it in real time. But perhaps there's something about the conditions right now which favors that. And in other times in Earth history, you might have pressures to evolve migration as opposed to lose it. So I wouldn't say it's disappearing. And then the other question is a difficult one, whether what you can get from phylogenies are those estimates of speciation, diversification, or neither of them. Are we making stories based on trees? Because you're right, we don't see what things went extinct. So actually, people often say you should talk about rates of diversification as opposed to speciation, which is the balance between speciation and extinction. But we actually used a method here which purportedly estimates speciation. But of course, that involves a bunch of different assumptions. So I think we can safely say that, yeah, lineages that are migratory probably have a more positive balance between speciation and extinction. We interpret it mostly as an effect of speciation, but it could also be that they go extinct at a lower rate.
So can I raise my hand and follow up on the migration thing? So in North America, birds are changing migration patterns too. I'm sure you know this. And that is, instead of staying in their southern place, they're staying in their northern place. And so I've seen this in my own yard in Michigan, where birds that used to only come through in migration in spring and summer, or spring and fall, are now there into the winter and all winter, some of them. And so the sedentary nature is also in the north. And I guess that's an observation. Climate change appears to be the cause. Is that going to change speciation rates? Are these species potentially stuck evolutionarily in terms of their diversification if they do that? Or your answer to the previous question suggesting that maybe the environment changes again, and so then they resume migration might, quote, save them from that?
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's sort of, it's funny, like we have the different perspectives. No, you're in Michigan, you're seeing the birds that stay there. I'm here in Colombia and I see the birds that stay here. But yeah, I think all these speaks to the fact that it's become apparent that like all the traits that are involved in migration, which are very complicated, no? Like things need to be able to accumulate reserves, navigate. There's a bunch of morphological adaptations. All these are kind of a syndrome that probably has very simple, genetic control. So given a change in the environment, and plasticity might play a role, these behaviors are expressed or not, and that makes populations evolve fairly quickly. And there's this idea in the literature that actually all birds might be sort of primed to migrate. So they have the genetic makeup that would allow to become a migrant or not. And whether they express that depends on the environment. So what I'm trying to say is that migrating or not migrating or changing migratory directions is probably highly labeled evolutionarily. So if these birds are switching behaviorally to say stay in the north, and then things deteriorate, they'll probably switch back and migrate again, I would guess. I don't know, but yeah.
I wonder if I could come in with another question. I hope if any of the participants want to charge in, just sort of put something in the chat, maybe, then we can see it as we go along. Maybe Michael's still monitoring that. Anyway, so my question is probably one for you, Jenny, because you've been more involved in developing theoretical models with Maria and so forth, is do you think our models encompass enough about variance in spatial and temporal variance in ecological drivers of divergence? Because on one hand, we've got this sort of macroecological view of stable habitats, both generating and retaining more diversity than strongly fluctuating one. And again, I'm thinking back to the Grant's work on Darwin's finches, where we've got all the pieces there. We've got the ecological drivers, we've got imprinting on song, we've got big size evolution correlated with song. So does the theory need to pay more attention to variability?
Some theories trying to do that. I'm not a theoretician. I collaborated with one. But there is theory that's trying to incorporate spatial variation in ecology. And there's actually a model that came before ours by Lethan McGonigal, where the model is basically just ecological selection. And it's just basically, it's spatial variation in ecology. And then there's sexual selection. And that's enough to get speciation to happen. So when you add in that spatial variation in the ecological parameters, that also facilitates the process.
What if you add temporal variation on top of that?
That's a great idea to do. Somebody might have, but I kind of don't think so. I mean, the models get complicated. So one of the things that happened when I was working on this with Maria is I'm the biologist trying to streamline the processes down to as few parameters as I can. And every time we do this, we add more complexity to the model, right? So it turned out to be a highly complex model. And I think solving those is hard. And so modelers like to go for the clean, simple things. That's one reason they do modeling. So I agree that it would be good to incorporate variation, whether it's in ecology or behavior or genetic variation, have on all those things acting together. It might make the models a little bit unwieldy. So I don't know, that's not much of an answer, but it's a great idea to do.
I don't have another question right now, but I just wanted to throw it to the audience. There's a Q&A panel that you can click on and you can type in a question in there. So if anyone in the audience has a question, we'd love to take that from you now. And while we're waiting for someone to type that in, Debbie, do you have any other questions that you want to ask?
I had an observation, just something that came up in the discussion was that I was just thinking how well, Jenny, your model and some of Daniel's work connects, because if, as you say, Daniel, migratory behaviour is a very plastic trait, but it means that populations can end up in very different environments. And so so that would impose very strong, selection for local adaptation, which could then initiate that process, Jenny, that you've modelled. So I was just thinking, they're quite different talks, but there is real connection between them.
Actually, there's an interesting, that's a good point, Debbie, and there's an interesting addition to the story that I didn't tell you about, but this is work that my student Valentina developed on her own later on, and she published on it earlier this year, I think, it's in integrative and comparative biology. So the migratory and the resident flycatchers, they differ in wing morphology. And one of the explanations for that is, well, it relates to migratory distance, well, to how much they need to move and that kind of thing. But Valentina actually found that these birds use their wings to produce sound. So they produce mechanical sound, which is involved in courtship. And the changes in the feathers, which might be partly influenced by natural selection in the context of being migratory or not, then affects a signal that is probably important in sexual contexts. So these things are now allopatric in terms of breeding ranges, but if they were to become sympatric, maybe you have at least the raw material for sexual selection to act on those signals and push them further apart.
Interesting.
Reminds me of beak's shape in Darwin's finches and song production.
I am going to take a question from the audience now, and this is a question from Nathan Butterworth, and it's for Daniel. And Daniel's asking, you mentioned that migration differences might result from behavioural plasticity. However, if this were the case, firstly, how would differences in behavioural plasticity be transmitted through generations and maintained? Which is funny, that was a question I was going to ask as well, Nathan. And secondly, presumably only a small portion of a population would initially start migrating due to this plasticity, but how could this lead to the entire population eventually migrating and subsequently to a new subspecies emerging?
Well, these are great questions, which I don't know the answer to, but I'm going to speculate. And maybe culture is very important. So birds, instead of migrating, they stay at a given site, and then they have babies, and they sort of learn that you just stay. But then it's still a puzzle how if this is driven by plasticity, how it eventually becomes canalized, and it becomes genetically determined, and then you get evolution into all these migratory or non-migratory phenotypes we talked about. So I guess what I'm saying is that my answer is not very satisfactory because I don't know. But the other way around, for me, it seems harder. Like, why? Like, if this was not triggered by plasticity but by genes, for me, it's hard to imagine that, say, an individual would be born with a mutation that would tell it to just stick around, and then how do you build a population from that? Because presumably a single individual is going to have that mutation, whereas if it's culturally transmitted, at least at the beginning, you might have a group staying, which would found the population and get the whole story going. But yeah, we don't have good answers for any of that, but those are great questions. I'm just speculating.
Okay, I'm back. There's just one more question in the chat that for Jenny. So I think we'll make that the last one, and then we should probably wrap this up because I can see that Craig looks like he's getting ready to leave. Just kidding. Okay, so it says, Jenny, you might have stated already, but I would like to ask, at what point would sexual selection be stronger than ecological selection? Since sexual selection is dependent on the availability of and providing choice, wouldn't choice be limited at the start of speciation, and similarly when a population is endangered?
Those are intriguing questions. I think there's two there. One is sexual selection stronger than ecological. The model doesn't actually pit these against each other. So we have ecological selection acting in allopatry, and there's female choice evolving in allopatry. And so again, we're not pitting one against the other. So that's the specific answer for the model. And I'll come back to more general answers if you want that later. And then you say sexual selection is dependent on having choice. And you're right, there's got to be variation there, both in the displays males have and the preferences females have, in order for there to be sexual selection. And so it requires some variation for sure. However, even if you let the allopatric process go, so there's fixation of choice for red and choice for large. There's fixation of male display for red and male display for large. Well, you can't have that because the displays are condition dependent, so that maintains variation. Then when you put them together in secondary contact, they're experiencing variation. Females can see males that vary in their trait display, and that provides the variation that's necessary and that you point out has to be there. And then you ask at the end when a population is endangered. So if populations are really small, then potentially that variation isn't present, and that might be a problem. And I'm sure there are people in the audience who've worked on endangered species and the loss of genetic variation, phenotypic variation, et cetera, that comes along when you've got really small population size, and how do you maintain that variation? So yeah, I think endangered species or any population that's at a very small size has limited evolutionary potential. Sometimes not as limited as we might initially think, but still limited. So that's my first answer. And if you want me to expand anything, you can prod me and I will, but otherwise I'll stop.
All right. Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you, Daniel. It's been so wonderful having this chat and like bring these kind of two, what seemed like quite different areas of research together. And